a stockbroker. Quite right. As a matter of fact, it was yesterday I heard from them. Poor Joanna's handwriting is rather noticeable, sprawls about all over the envelope like an inebriated spider. What does Joanna say? Any news? Mrs. Allerton strove to make her voice sound casual and ordinary. The friendship between her son and his second cousin, Joanna Southwood, always irritated her. Not, as she put it to herself, that there was anything in it. She was quite sure there wasn't. Tim had never manifested a sentimental interest in Joanna, nor she in him. Their mutual attraction seemed to be founded on gossip and the possession of a large number of friends and acquaintances in common. They both liked people and discussing people. Joanna had an amusing if caustic tongue. It was not because Mrs. Allerton feared that Tim might fall in love with Joanna that she found herself always becoming a little stiff in manner if Joanna were present or when letters from her arrived. It was some other feeling, hard to define, perhaps an unacknowledged jealousy in the unfeigned pleasure Tim always seemed to take in Joanna's society. He and his mother were such perfect companions that the sight of him absorbed and interested in another woman always startled Mrs. Allerton slightly. She fancied, too, that her own presence on these occasions set some barrier between the two members of the younger generation. Often she had come upon them eagerly absorbed in some conversation, and at sight of her their talk had wavered, had seemed to include her rather too purposefully, and if duty-bound. Quite definitely Mrs. Allerton did not like Joanna Southwood. She thought her insincere, affected and essentially superficial. She found it very hard to prevent herself saying so in unmeasured tones. In answer to her question, Tim pulled the letter out of his pocket and glanced through it. It was quite a long letter, his mother noted. Nothing much, he said. The Devonishes are getting a divorce. Old Monty's been had up for being drunk in charge of a car. Windlesham's gone to Canada. Seems he was pretty badly hit when Linnet Ridgway turned him down. She's definitely going to marry this land agent person. How extraordinary. Is he very dreadful? No, not at all. He's one of the Devonshire Doyles. No money, of course, and he was actually engaged to one of Linnet's best friends. Pretty thick, that. I don't think it's at all nice, said Mrs. Allerton, flushing. Tim flashed her a quick, affectionate glance. I know, darling, you don't approve of snaffling other people's husbands and all that sort of thing. In my day, we had our standards, said Mrs. Allerton, and a very good thing too. Nowadays, young people seem to think they can just go about doing anything they choose. Tim smiled. They don't only think it, they do it. Vide Linnet Ridgway. Well, I think it's horrid. Tim twinkled at her. Cheer up, you old diehard. Perhaps I agree with you. Anyway, I haven't helped myself to anyone's wife or fiancée yet. I'm sure you'd never do such a always wanted to see Egypt. When do you suggest? Oh, next month. January's about the best time there. We'll enjoy the delightful society in this hotel a few weeks longer. Tim, said Mrs. Allerton reproachfully. Then she added, guiltily, I'm afraid I promised Mrs. Leach that you'd go with her to the police station. She doesn't understand any Spanish. Tim made a grimace. About her ring, the blood-red ruby of the horse leech's daughter. Does she still persist in thinking it's been stolen? I'll go if you like, but it's a waste of time. She'll only get some wretched chambermaid into trouble. I distinctly saw it on her finger when she went into the sea that day. It came off in the water, and she never noticed. She says she's quite sure she took it off and left it on her dressing table. Well, she didn't. I saw it with my own eyes. The woman's a fool. Any woman's a fool who goes prancing into the sea in December, pretending the water's quite warm, just because the sun happens to be shining rather brightly at the moment. Stout women oughtn't to be allowed to bathe anyway. They look so revolting in bathing dresses. Mrs. Allerton murmured, I really feel I ought to give up bathing. Tim gave a shout of laughter. You can give most of the young things points and to spare. Mrs. Allerton sighed and said, I wish there were a few more young people for you here. Tim Allerton shook his head decidedly. I don't. You and I get along rather comfortably without outside distractions. You'd like it if Joanna were here. I wouldn't. His tone was unexpectedly resolute. You're all wrong there. Joanna amuses me, but I don't really like her, and to have her around much gets on my nerves. I'm thankful she isn't here. I should be quite resigned if I were never to see Joanna again. He added, almost below his breath, there's only one woman in the world I've got a real respect and admiration for, and I think, Mrs. Allerton, you know very well who that woman is. His mother blushed and looked quite confused. Tim said gravely, there aren't very many really nice women in the world. You happen to be one of them. Chapter 9. In an apartment overlooking Central Park in New York, Mrs. Robson exclaimed, if that isn't just too lovely, you really are the luckiest girl, Cornelia. Cornelia Robson flushed responsively. She was a big, clumsy-looking girl with brown, dog-like eyes. Oh, it will be wonderful, she gasped. Old Miss Van Schuyler inclined her head in a satisfied fashion at this correct attitude on the part of poor relations. I've always dreamed of a trip to Europe, sighed Cornelia, but I just didn't feel I'd ever get there. Miss Bowers will come with me as usual, of course, said Miss Van Schuyler, but as a social companion, I find her limited, very limited. There are many little things that Cornelia can do for me. I'd just love to, Cousin Marie, said Cornelia eagerly. Well then, that's settled, said Miss Van Schuyler. Just run and find Miss Bowers, my dear. It's time for my eggnog. Cornelia departed. Her mother said, my dear Marie, I'm really most grateful to you. You know I think Cornelia suffers a lot from not being a social success. It makes her feel kind of mortified. If I could afford to take her to places. But you know how it's been since Ned died. I'm very glad to take her, said Miss Van Schuyler. Mrs. Otterbourne, readjusting the turban of native material that she wore draped around her head, said fretfully, "I really don't see why we shouldn't go on to Egypt. I'm sick and tired of Jerusalem." As her daughter made no reply, she said, "You might at least answer when you're spoken to." Rosalie Otterbourne was looking at a newspaper reproduction of a face. Below it was printed, Mrs. Simon Doyle, who before her marriage was the well-known society beauty, Miss Linnet Ridgway. Mr. and Mrs. Doyle are spending their holiday in Egypt. Rosalie said, "You'd like to move on to Egypt, Mother?" "Yes, I would," Mrs. Otterbourne snapped. "I consider they've treated us in a most cavalier fashion here. My being here is an advertisement. I ought to get a special reduction in terms. When I hinted as much, I considered they were most impertinent. Most impertinent. I told them exactly what I thought of them." The girl sighed. She said, "One place is very like another. I wish we could get right away." "And this morning," went on Mrs. Otterbourne, "the manager actually had the impertinence to tell me that all the rooms had been booked in advance and that he would require ours in 2 days' time. So we've got to go somewhere." "Not at